Hello. Welcome back to Insomnia History, where we bring you the darkest and most chilling stories from the past to light up your night. Before we feast on this tale, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, because every click fuels our passion for uncovering the twisted moments that shaped history. Now, let's step into the shadowy halls of Edinburgh Castle, where in 1440, a banquet turned into a nightmare. A dinner that began with fine food and music, but ended with the brutal execution of two young boys. The Black Dinner wasn't just a feast. It was a bloody trap that changed the course of Scottish history. Ready for a story that inspired Game of Thrones? Let's get started. The grey stone walls of Edinburgh Castle stand tall against the Scottish sky, a silent witness to centuries of intrigue, violence, and power struggles that have shaped the nation's history. Among the many dark chapters written within its ancient halls, few are as chilling as the events of November 1440, known to history as the Black Dinner. To understand this brutal episode, we must first immerse ourselves in the complex world of 15th century Scotland, a realm where loyalty was fleeting and power hung in a delicate balance. Scotland, in the 1440s, was a kingdom in turmoil. The assassination of King James I in 1437 had plunged the nation into a period of instability and factional conflict. James had been a strong monarch who worked tirelessly to centralize royal authority and curb the influence of powerful noble families. His efforts to strengthen the crown had made him enemies among the aristocracy, ultimately leading to his brutal murder in Perth by a group of conspirators led by Sir Robert Graham. This violent end to James's reign would cast a long shadow over Scotland, leaving the kingdom vulnerable to the very forces the king had sought to control. The social and political structure of medieval Scotland was a complex web of loyalties and obligations. At its heart was a feudal system where land ownership formed the basis of power. The king stood at the apex of this pyramid, granting lands to nobles in exchange for military service and political support. These nobles, in turn, had their own vassals, creating chains of obligation and allegiance that extended throughout society. In theory, the monarch was the supreme authority, but in practice, royal power was often constrained by the collective influence of powerful noble families who controlled vast territories and commanded the loyalty of thousands. Unlike England, which had developed stronger central institutions, Scotland remained largely a federation of semi-autonomous regions dominated by aristocratic clans. These noble families, including names like Douglas, Gordon, Campbell, and Stuart, controlled not just land but also administered justice, raised armies, and sometimes conducted their own foreign policy. The balance between royal authority and aristocratic power was delicate, requiring a monarch skilled in both diplomacy and intimidation to maintain control. When that balance tipped, as it did after James I's death, chaos often followed. The Scottish economy of this period was predominantly agrarian, with wealth measured primarily in land, livestock, and the harvests they produced. Towns were growing in importance as centers of trade, particularly along the east coast, where connections to continental Europe facilitated the export of wool, hides, and fish in exchange for luxury goods, weapons, and wine. Edinburgh was emerging as the kingdom's administrative center, though the royal court remained somewhat itinerant, traveling between various strongholds across the realm. Religion played a central role in Scottish society, with the Catholic Church wielding significant influence in both spiritual and temporal affairs. Monasteries and cathedrals were centers of learning and administration, while bishops often served as royal officials. The church provided a unifying cultural force in a fragmented political landscape, though it too could become entangled in factional struggles. In rural areas, older Celtic traditions still influenced popular belief, creating a distinctive Scottish religious culture even within the broader framework of medieval Catholicism. When James I was killed, his son and heir, also named James, was only 6 years old. The young James II was crowned at Holyrood Abbey in Edinburgh on March 25, 1437. But a child king could not effectively rule. This necessitated a regency government that would administer the kingdom until James reached maturity. Immediately, the question of who would control this regency became the central issue in Scottish politics, setting the stage for years of conflict among ambitious nobles and officials. The young king was notable for a prominent birthmark on his face, earning him the nickname Fiery Face or James of the Fiery Face. This physical characteristic would become almost symbolic of his later reign, which would be marked by fiery determination and sometimes impulsive action. But in 1437, he was merely a child, a pawn in the greater game of Scottish politics, surrounded by adults with conflicting agendas and ambitions. James II's mother, Joan Beaufort, initially attempted to secure the regency for herself. As Queen Dowager, she had a legitimate claim to protect her son's interests. However, she faced opposition from powerful nobles who were unwilling to allow a woman, especially one with English connections, to exercise such authority. Her position was further weakened when she remarried in 1439 to Sir James Stuart, the Black Knight of Lorne, an alliance that caused resentment among other nobles who saw it as potentially creating a new power block around the throne. The power vacuum created by James I's death and his heirs' minority triggered an intense struggle for control of the regency. The main contenders were Sir William Crackton, who controlled Edinburgh Castle and held the office of Chancellor, and Sir Alexander Livingston, who commanded Stirling Castle, where the young king was primarily kept. These two men represented different factions within the Scottish political elite, and their rivalry would dominate and destabilize Scottish politics for nearly a decade. Crackton had served James I as master of the royal household and had quickly secured control of Edinburgh Castle in the aftermath of the king's assassination. From this powerful position, he established himself as a key figure in the new administration. Shrewd and ambitious, Crackton understood the value of controlling the machinery of government. As Chancellor, he had authority over the royal seal, giving him significant influence over official communications and legal documents. This position allowed him to present himself as representing continuity and legitimate authority in uncertain times. Livingston, meanwhile, had maneuvered to gain custody of the young king and queen mother at Stirling Castle, traditionally a royal stronghold and nursery. By controlling the king's person, Livingston could claim to act in James's name and use royal authority to legitimize his actions. Both men publicly claimed to be serving the interests of the crown while privately pursuing their own ambitions and those of their allies. Their rivalry was not merely personal, but represented competing networks of power and patronage throughout the kingdom. The factional struggle between Crackton and Livingston was complicated by the existence of other power centers in the kingdom. The Queen Mother and her new husband formed one such alternative pole of influence. Various noble families, particularly those who had been favored or persecuted under James I, positioned themselves strategically in relation to the competing regents. Some supported Crackton, others Livingston, while many simply focused on consolidating their own local authority while central power was weak. This period of divided authority created significant challenges for governance. Justice became inconsistent, with outcomes often determined by factional allegiances rather than law. Royal finances suffered as various officials diverted revenues to support their own causes. Foreign relations became complicated as different factions pursued conflicting diplomatic initiatives. The common people experienced increased insecurity as law enforcement weakened, and local magnates exercised their power with less restraint. In this unstable environment, Crackton and Livingston were initially bitter rivals, each seeking to outmaneuver the other. However, by 1439, they had reached an uneasy accommodation. recognizing that their continued conflict only created opportunities for other factions to gain advantage. Their temporary alliance was based on mutual self-interest rather than trust, and it would be tested severely as new challenges emerged to their shared authority. The most significant of these challenges came from the House of Douglas, Scotland's most powerful noble family. The Douglases had risen to prominence in the previous century through loyal service to the crown, strategic marriages, and military prowess. By the 1440s, they controlled vast territories in southern Scotland and had extensive connections with other noble families. Their power had grown to such an extent that they represented a virtual state within the state, with resources that rivaled or exceeded those of the crown itself. The Douglas lands stretched across southern Scotland, from their heartland in Lanarkshire and Douglasdale to holdings in Galloway, Moray, and Annandale. They controlled key castles, maintained private armies, and commanded the loyalty of numerous lesser nobles and their followers. The family had traditionally been supporters of royal authority, often serving as military commanders and royal officials. However, their relationship with the crown was complex, oscillating between periods of loyal service and episodes of dangerous rivalry. Under James I, the Douglases had experienced a period of royal disfavor, as the king sought to limit their independence and integrate them more firmly into his centralized vision of the Scottish state. The king had executed the 5th Earl of Douglas in 1440, after convicting him of treason, briefly confiscating Douglas lands before restoring them to the earl's son. This history of tension created a foundation of mistrust between the Douglas family and royal officials like Crichton, who had served James I and shared his suspicion of overmighty subjects. The death of James I and the subsequent weakening of central authority had allowed the Douglases to recover much of their former independence and influence. The family now posed a significant challenge to the authority of Crichton and Livingston, who saw Douglas power as a direct threat to their control of the Regency government. As tensions rose, Scotland seemed poised on the brink of a confrontation that would determine the balance of power in the kingdom for years to come. While political maneuvering consumed the attention of Scotland's elites, ordinary life continued for the majority of the population. Farmers tilled their fields and tended their livestock. Merchants conducted trade, and craftsmen practiced their skills, all against the backdrop of political uncertainty. Most common people had little direct involvement in high politics, but all were affected by the stability or instability of governance. Weak central authority often meant increased local exploitation, as regional powers filled the vacuum with their own demands for revenue and service. By 1440, the stage was set for a dramatic confrontation between the Regency government and the House of Douglas. The young king, not yet 10 years old, remained largely a spectator to these events, though decisions made in his name would shape both his reign and Scotland's future. The kingdom stood at a crossroads, with competing visions for its governance and conflict. Would royal authority prevail over aristocratic power, or would Scotland continue as a patchwork of regional influences under nominal royal oversight? The tensions that had been building would soon find their terrible resolution in an event that would shock contemporaries and echo through Scottish history for centuries to come. A dinner invitation would be extended, a castle table would be set, and blood would be spilled in one of history's most infamous betrayals. But to understand why this betrayal was conceived and how it was executed, we must first turn our attention to the extraordinary power and influence of the House of Douglas and the young Earl, who would soon find himself at the center of a deadly conspiracy. The House of Douglas stood as a colossus in the landscape of Scottish power. Their origin story was woven into the very fabric of Scottish identity, dating back to the days of Robert the Bruce and the Wars of Independence. Legend held that a warrior named William de Douglas had earned the king's favor through exceptional bravery in battle against the English. This foundation myth, whether entirely accurate or embellished over generations, established the Douglases as defenders of Scottish sovereignty and liberty, a narrative they cultivated carefully through the centuries. By the mid-15th century, the Douglases had transformed from mere warriors into one of the most sophisticated political dynasties in Scotland. Their rise had been methodical, built on military service, strategic marriages, royal favor, and calculated ambition. They had expanded their influence through each generation, accumulating lands, titles, and privileges until they rivaled the crown itself in wealth and influence. Their heraldic emblem, a heart to commemorate how a Douglas had carried Robert Bruce's heart on crusade, adorned castles, churches, and manor houses across southern Scotland. The family's territories were vast and strategically significant. Their heartland centered on Douglasdale and Lanarkshire, but their holdings stretched across the Scottish borders, into Galloway in the southwest, and even to estates in northern Scotland. This geographical spread gave them control of key transportation routes, productive agricultural lands, and lucrative customs points. In an age when land equated directly to power, the Douglases possessed an empire within a kingdom. The Douglas lands were not merely extensive, but formed a nearly contiguous block of territory that functioned almost as an independent principality. Within this domain, the Earl and his kinsmen administered justice, collected revenues, maintained order, and commanded military forces with minimal royal interference. They controlled important castles like Thrieve, Tantallon, and Douglas Castle itself, formidable strongholds that could withstand lengthy sieges and served as visible symbols of Douglas might. Their wealth was legendary. Annual revenues from their estates, combined with income from customs, judicial fines, and feudal dues, provided resources that sometimes exceeded those of the royal treasury. This financial power translated directly into political and military strength. The Douglases could afford to maintain large retinues of armed men, reward loyal followers with lands and offices, and engage in impressive displays of aristocratic largesse that enhanced their reputation and attracted additional supporters. The family's strength derived not only from their own resources, but also from an extensive network of alliances and client relationships. Lesser noble families throughout southern Scotland looked to the Douglases for protection and patronage. Marriage alliances connected them to other powerful families, creating a web of kinship that extended their influence far beyond their direct territorial holdings. This network functioned as both a political coalition and a military alliance, ready to be mobilized in support of Douglas interests. Their position in Scottish society had been further enhanced through service to the Crown and Church. Douglases had served as royal officers, military commanders, ambassadors, and advisors to successive monarchs. They had founded religious houses, endowed chapels, and placed family members in ecclesiastical offices. Through these contributions, they had positioned themselves as pillars of the established order while simultaneously building institutional power bases that served their family interests. The Black Douglas line, as they were known to distinguish them from their relatives the Red Douglases of Angus, had reached the apex of their power under Archibald Douglas, the 5th Earl. Known as Archibald the Grim for his formidable countenance and martial prowess, he had consolidated Douglas holdings and elevated the family to unprecedented influence. His successors had maintained this position, carefully navigating the complex politics of the Scottish court while preserving their semi-autonomous status in their own territories. By 1440, the head of this mighty house was William Douglas, the 6th Earl of Douglas. At just 16 years of age, he had inherited his titles and estates following his father's death 2 years earlier. Despite his youth, William was already displaying the pride and confidence befitting the heir to Scotland's most powerful noble dynasty. He had been raised to understand his family's exalted position and the responsibilities that came with it. His education had prepared him for leadership, combining martial training with instruction in the administrative and diplomatic skills necessary for governing the Douglas domains. William was described by contemporaries as handsome and charismatic, already showing promise as a leader who could command loyalty. He had been carefully groomed for his position, surrounded by advisors loyal to the Douglas cause, who guided his early decisions while allowing him to develop his own authority. Though young, he was legally an adult by medieval standards and fully empowered to exercise his rights as Earl. He traveled with an impressive retinue, befitting his status, the size and splendor of which often eclipsed the royal household itself. The young Earl was accompanied in his responsibilities by his brother David, a boy of only 12 years. David Douglas shared his brother's noble bearing and proud heritage, though he lacked the formal authority that came with the earldom. Together, they represented the future of the Black Douglas line, young scions of a house that had survived and thrived through generations of Scotland's turbulent history. Their youth, far from being a weakness, symbolized the continuing vitality and dynastic security of their family. The brothers resided primarily at their family's strongholds, including the imposing Thrieve Castle in Galloway. Built on an island in the River Dee, this fortress epitomized Douglas power, seemingly impregnable, dominating the surrounding landscape, and capable of sustaining itself independently through sieges. From such secure bases, the young Earl administered his vast holdings, received homage from his vassals, and began to assert his place in the wider political landscape of Scotland. William's position was reinforced by the complex system of loyalties that characterized medieval Scottish society. As Earl, he automatically commanded the allegiance of numerous knights, lairds, and lesser nobles, who held lands from him through feudal tenure. These men owed him military service, counsel, and support in exchange for his protection and patronage. Beyond these formal relationships, many others aligned themselves with the Douglas cause out of tradition, self-interest, or recognition of the family's power. This network created a formidable power block that any rival, including the crown, would find difficult to challenge. The military strength at the young Earl's disposal was substantial. Estimates suggest that the Douglases could raise several thousand men-at-arms and archers from their own lands, supplemented by additional forces from allied families. This private army included experienced captains, men-at-arms with quality equipment, and trained archers. In an era when the royal forces relied heavily on feudal levies and lacked a standing army, the Douglas military capability represented a significant portion of Scotland's total martial strength. Beyond raw military power, the Douglases possessed political influence through multiple channels. Their representatives sat in the Scottish Parliament, they maintained connections with church officials, and they had established relationships with merchant communities and burghs throughout their territories. They also conducted their own foreign policy to some extent, maintaining direct communications with England, France, and other European powers. These international connections gave them additional leverage in domestic politics and access to resources and intelligence beyond Scotland's borders. The relationship between the House of Douglas and the Scottish Crown had always been complex. At times, they had been the monarchy's strongest supporters, defending royal interests and expanding royal authority. At other times, they had acted as a check on royal power, resisting centralization efforts that threatened their autonomy. This ambiguity made them simultaneously essential allies and potential threats to any monarch or regent. Their loyalty could never be taken for granted, but neither could they be easily dismissed or controlled. Under James I, the Crown had attempted to curb Douglas independence, part of the king's broader effort to strengthen royal authority at the expense of regional magnates. James had used legal proceedings, financial pressures, and occasional shows of force to remind the Douglases of royal supremacy. These efforts had created tensions, but had not fundamentally weakened Douglas power. Instead, they had fostered resentment and suspicion that lingered after James's death, and colored the family's interactions with the Regency government. With the king's assassination and the establishment of a regency dominated by Crichton and Livingston, the political dynamic had shifted again. The weakened central authority created opportunities for the Douglases to reassert their traditional independence. At the same time, it placed them in direct competition with the regents for influence over national affairs. From the perspective of Crichton and Livingston, the Douglas power represented an existential threat to their control of the government and potentially to the young king himself. The young Earl William had begun to flex his political muscles in ways that alarmed the regents. He traveled with a retinue whose size and grandeur surpassed that of the royal court. He conducted himself with the confidence of a man who recognized few superiors. He intervened in local disputes beyond his territories, extending Douglas influence into regions previously under royal administration. Most worryingly for the regents, he had begun to form connections with other noble families who were dissatisfied with the current governance arrangements. Reports reached Edinburgh, Stirling of increasing Douglas activity along the borders, of diplomatic contacts with England, and of the young Earl receiving homage from men who traditionally owed their primary allegiance to the crown. These developments suggested a deliberate strategy to consolidate and expand Douglas influence during the king's minority. For men like Crichton, whose power depended on their control of royal authority, such activities represented a direct challenge that could not be ignored. The specific catalyst that transformed concern into action remains somewhat obscure in historical records. Some accounts suggest that William had begun to petition for a formal role in the Regency government, leveraging his family's traditional claim to influence royal policy. Others indicate that conflicts had emerged over specific judicial or administrative decisions, with Douglas representatives challenging the regent's authority in particular cases. Still, others point to territorial disputes, where the boundaries between royal and Douglas authority had become contentious. Whatever the immediate cause, by 1440, the situation had reached a critical point. The regents viewed the 16-year-old Earl and his brother as the living embodiments of a power structure that threatened their own position and potentially the long-term authority of the crown itself. William and David Douglas, though young, represented a noble tradition that had sometimes overshadowed the monarchy. Their youth made them vulnerable, but also dangerous. They had decades of potential leadership ahead of them, during which Douglas power might grow even further. The political calculations in Edinburgh Castle and Stirling Castle turned increasingly dark. If the Douglas threat was to be neutralized, decisive action would be required. Military confrontation was risky. The regent's forces might not prevail against the Douglas military machine, and open conflict would destabilize the kingdom further. Legal proceedings would be complicated by questions of jurisdiction and the Douglases' ability to influence outcomes through their extensive connections. A more direct, more final solution began to take shape in the minds of those who saw the young Douglas brothers as obstacles to their vision of a Scotland under firm central control. Thus, the stage was set for one of history's most infamous acts of political treachery. The exceptional power of the House of Douglas, embodied in two young men who had barely reached manhood, had created a situation that the regents believed could not be resolved through normal political means. The ancient tension between crown and nobility, between central authority and regional power, would find its expression in a dinner invitation that concealed deadly intent. The Black Dinner was about to enter the planning stage, a conspiracy that would shock contemporaries with its violation of sacred hospitality and leave an indelible mark on Scottish history. While the young Douglas brothers commanded their vast ancestral domains, the governance of Scotland rested primarily in the hands of two men whose rivalry and eventual collaboration would shape the kingdom's future. Sir William Crichton and Sir Alexander Livingston represented a different kind of power than the hereditary might of the Douglases. Their authority derived not from ancient lineage or vast territorial holdings, but from their positions within the machinery of royal government and their control of key royal assets. They were men who had risen through administrative skill, political acumen, and opportunism, seizing the chance to fill the power vacuum created by James I's assassination and his heirs minor. William Crichton had established himself as one of Scotland's most significant political figures through his control of Edinburgh Castle and his position as Chancellor of Scotland. Edinburgh Castle stood as the most symbolically important royal fortress in the kingdom, commanding the growing capital city from its dramatic perch atop Castle Rock. From this virtually impregnable position, Crichton controlled not only a powerful military stronghold, but also the administrative heart of royal government. As Chancellor, he held the Great Seal of Scotland, the essential instrument for authenticating royal documents, giving him effective control over official communications and legal processes. Crichton's background placed him in the category of the lesser nobility, a knight rather than a great magnate. His family had held lands in Midlothian for generations, but had never ranked among Scotland's premier aristocratic houses. His rise to prominence had come through royal service, rather than territorial power. Under James I, he had served as master of the royal household, gaining intimate knowledge of court operations and building a network of relationships with officials throughout the government. This administrative experience, combined with political shrewdness, had positioned him to act decisively when James was assassinated, securing both Edinburgh Castle and the Chancellorship before potential rivals could organize. Alexander Livingston's power base centered on Stirling Castle, the traditional residence for royal children, and a fortress of immense strategic importance controlling the main crossing of the River Forth. By establishing himself as keeper of Stirling, Livingston had gained physical custody of the young king, giving him the ability to claim that his actions carried royal authority. Like Crichton, Livingston came from the ranks of the lesser nobility rather than the great magnate families. His rise represented the increasing importance of administrative competence and political maneuvering in Scottish governance, where traditional aristocratic power was being challenged by a new class of royal servants. Livingston held the title of justiciar, giving him authority over royal justice in a significant portion of the kingdom. This position provided him with both legal power and financial resources, as judicial proceedings generated substantial revenues through fines and forfeitures. He had also secured appointment as governor to the young king, formalizing his role as the monarch's guardian and tutor. These combined responsibilities gave him significant influence over both the administration of the realm and the development of the future king's worldview and loyalties. The relationship between Crichton and Livingston had evolved through several phases since 1437. Initially, they had been open rivals, each seeking to establish himself as the dominant figure in the Regency government. Their competition had occasionally flared into direct confrontation, with some chroniclers recording incidents of armed standoffs and mutual kidnapping attempts. The kingdom had briefly functioned with parallel administrations, each claiming legitimate authority and attempting to undermine the other. This period of division had further weakened central governance and created opportunities for regional powers like the Douglases to operate with minimal oversight. By 1439, however, pragmatic considerations had led Crichton and Livingston toward an uneasy accommodation. Their continued conflict had benefited neither man and had threatened to allow other factions to displace them both. A formal reconciliation had been arranged, dividing responsibilities between them while maintaining their respective power bases. Crichton would control government administration from Edinburgh, while Livingston would maintain custody of the king at Stirling and oversee royal estates. This arrangement stabilized the Regency government, but remained founded on mutual suspicion rather than trust. Both men were experienced political operators who understood that their positions rested on fragile foundations. Neither could claim the traditional authority of the great noble houses or the legitimacy of direct royal appointment. Their power depended on their continued control of key assets, castles, offices, and access to the king, and their ability to prevent alternative power centers from challenging their authority. In this context, the House of Douglas represented both a model of the traditional aristocratic power they had supplanted and a potential threat that could reverse their fortunes. The regent's relationship with Queen Joan, the king's mother, added another layer of complexity to the political situation. Initially, Joan had sought to claim the regency for herself, as would have been common for a queen mother in many European kingdoms. However, Scottish political traditions were less favorable to female regents, and Joan found herself outmaneuvered by both Crichton and Livingston. Her position had been further complicated by her marriage to Sir James Stuart, the Black Knight of Lorne, which had been perceived by many as an attempt to create a new power bloc around her and her husband. Tensions between the Queen Mother and the regents had culminated in a dramatic confrontation at Stirling Castle in 1439. According to contemporary accounts, Livingston had effectively placed Joan under house arrest when she attempted to assert greater influence over her son's upbringing and government. She was eventually released after agreeing to surrender her claims to a formal role in the regency and accepting Livingston's continued custody of the young king. This episode demonstrated the regent's willingness to take bold, even legally questionable actions when they perceived threats to their authority. The reconciliation between Crichton and Livingston coincided with growing concerns about Douglas power. From their respective positions, both men observed developments that suggested the young Earl of Douglas was preparing to claim a more prominent role in national governance. Reports reached them of increasing Douglas diplomatic activity, of the young Earl's ostentatious displays of wealth and military strength, and of his efforts to build alliances with other noble families. These activities fit the pattern of a magnate preparing to assert greater political influence, potentially challenging the regent's control of the government. For Crichton especially, the Douglas threat appeared existential. As Chancellor, he had worked to maintain the administrative systems developed under James I, which had sought to strengthen central authority at the expense of regional magnates. The Douglases represented precisely the kind of semi-autonomous power that this centralizing agenda aimed to curtail. Moreover, Crichton's personal position lacked the security of ancient lineage or vast territorial holdings. His authority rested primarily on his control of royal institutions, which would be directly threatened if a figure like the Earl of Douglas succeeded in establishing a dominant influence over the young king. Livingston shared many of these concerns, though his position as the king's guardian gave him different perspectives and interests. He had invested considerable effort in establishing himself as the primary influence on James II's development, shaping the young monarch's understanding of his role and his relationships with various noble factions. The introduction of Douglas' influence at court would undermine this carefully cultivated position. Additionally, Livingston recognized that his control of Stirling Castle, while significant, could not match the military resources available to the Douglas Earl if conflict emerged. The regent's fears were compounded by historical precedent. Scotland's history provided numerous examples of powerful magnates who had effectively controlled royal policy during monarchs as minorities, often establishing dynastic dominance that persisted for generations. The Douglases themselves had previously exercised such influence under earlier kings. The prospect of history repeating itself, with Douglas power overshadowing royal authority for decades to come, presented a nightmare scenario for men whose own status depended on their control of royal institutions. Scottish politics in this period operated according to unwritten but understood rules of engagement. Direct attacks on established noble houses, particularly those with extensive kinship networks like the Douglases, carried significant risks. Such actions could trigger blood feuds, regional uprisings, or even civil war. The conventional approach to political competition involved gradually undermining rivals through legal processes, strategic alliances, and incremental pressure rather than sudden, violent action. However, the regents were coming to believe that conventional methods would be insufficient to address the Douglas threat. The legal options available to Crichton and Livingston appeared limited. Formal charges of treason against the young Earl would be difficult to substantiate, and might not receive support from other nobles who recognized that such precedents could be turned against them in the future. Administrative measures to restrict Douglas authority would likely be ignored in Douglas territories, where royal officials had limited practical power. Economic sanctions would have minimal impact on a family whose resources were largely self-contained within their extensive domains. These constraints pushed the regents toward considering more drastic measures. The personal dynamics between the key figures added emotional dimensions to the political calculations. Crichton, as a man who had risen through ability rather than birth, may have harbored resentment toward the inherited privilege and youthful arrogance of the Douglas brothers. Livingston, focused on maintaining his influence over the young king, would have viewed any potential rival for James's loyalty as a direct threat. Both men had invested years in building their positions and would have felt profound insecurity at the prospect of being displaced by representatives of traditional aristocratic power. Their concerns were not without foundation. Historical records suggest that William Douglas had indeed begun to position himself for a greater role in national affairs. The young Earl had been making visits to other noble houses, receiving pledges of support from regional leaders, and possibly engaging in discussions with English officials along the border. He had also begun to assert Douglas prerogatives in legal disputes, challenging the jurisdiction of royal officials in territories where Douglas influence had traditionally been dominant. These activities, while not necessarily treasonous, indicated ambitions that extended beyond merely managing his inherited estates. Crichton's position as keeper of Edinburgh Castle gave him both practical and symbolic advantages in addressing the perceived Douglas threat. The castle functioned as both a fortress and a royal palace, capable of hosting state occasions while also serving as a secure location for potentially dangerous political maneuvers. Its great hall provided an appropriate setting for formal royal entertainments, maintaining the appearance of normal court functions while concealing more sinister intentions. The castle's defenses ensured that once guests were inside, they were effectively isolated from potential allies or rescuers. As Chancellor, Crichton also controlled the mechanisms for issuing royal invitations and safe-conducts, documents that carried significant legal and cultural weight. A formal invitation in the king's name, accompanied by guarantees of safe passage, represented not just a social occasion, but a solemn commitment of royal protection. The violation of such guarantees was considered an extremely serious breach of medieval political norms, something that would not be contemplated except in the most extraordinary circumstances. That Crichton was willing to consider such a violation indicated the depth of his concern about the Douglas threat. The decision to move against the Douglases would not have been taken lightly. Contemporary chronicles suggest that extensive consultations occurred between Crichton, Livingston, and a small circle of trusted advisors. These discussions would have weighed the immediate benefits of removing the Douglas brothers against the potential long-term consequences of such a provocative act. They would have considered alternative approaches and the likelihood of success for each option. Ultimately, they concluded that more conventional methods would be insufficient to neutralize the threat posed by the young Earl and his brother. By autumn 1440, a plan had begun to take shape, i.e., it would exploit the vulnerabilities created by the Douglas brothers' youth and inexperience, while leveraging the regent's control of royal authority and key facilities. It would need to separate the brothers from their military strength, isolate them from potential allies, and create a situation where resistance would be impossible. Most importantly, it would need to provide a veneer of legitimacy however thin, to prevent the action from being immediately condemned as simple murder. These requirements pointed toward a solution that would use the formalities of royal hospitality to mask deadly intent. As November approached, William Crichton began preparations for what would become known to history as the Black Dinner. Acting in the name of the 10-year-old King James II, he drafted formal invitations to the Earl of Douglas and his brother, ostensibly offering reconciliation and proposing discussions about the young Earl's future role in royal governance. These documents, bearing the royal seal and providing guarantees of safe conduct, would serve as the bait in a trap designed to eliminate a threat that conventional politics could not contain. The stage was set for one of history's most infamous betrayals of hospitality, a calculated act of state violence disguised as a royal banquet. The plan that would culminate in the Black Dinner began to take definitive shape in the autumn of 1440. William Crichton, operating from the secure confines of Edinburgh Castle, initiated a series of private meetings with trusted advisors to discuss the Douglas problem. These gatherings were held in the Chancellor's private chambers, away from the ears of castle staff and possible informants. Only those absolutely essential to the conspiracy were included, creating a tight circle of confidants bound by shared purpose and mutual self-preservation. Crichton's primary co-conspirator remained Alexander Livingston, despite their history of rivalry. The two men recognized that addressing the Douglas threat required their combined resources and authority. Messengers traveled discreetly between Edinburgh and Stirling castles, carrying verbal communications rather than written documents that might later serve as evidence. Their discussions focused on timing, justifications, and the critical question of how to ensure the young Douglas brothers would attend the proposed gathering without the substantial military escort that typically accompanied them. The conspirators considered several approaches before settling on a formal royal invitation. A summons for consultation on matters of state would appear natural, as the Earl of Douglas held hereditary offices that made his involvement in governance legitimate. The invitation would come in the name of the young king, James II, invoking royal authority that even the proud Douglases would hesitate to reject. Most importantly, it would include explicit guarantees of safe conduct, a solemn promise of protection that held significant legal and cultural weight in medieval Scotland. The timing of the invitation was calculated carefully. November 1440 represented a period when travel remained feasible before winter conditions made Scottish roads nearly impassable. Additionally, this timing allowed the regents to observe recent Douglas activities and adjust their plans accordingly. Reports had indicated that the young Earl had been particularly active in building alliances during the preceding months, increasing the urgency of action from the regent's perspective. The specific date selected, November 24, had no particular significance but provided sufficient time for the Douglas party to travel to Edinburgh, while allowing the castle staff to make necessary preparations. The wording of the invitation demanded particular attention. It needed to be sufficiently formal to reflect the dignity of both the crown and the Douglas earldom, while also warm enough to allay potential suspicions. The document emphasized the king's personal desire to become better acquainted with the young earl, who was, after all, one of his most important subjects. It mentioned discussions of matters beneficial to the realm, suggesting the possibility of a more formalized role for Douglas in governance. The language was crafted to appeal to both the Earl's sense of duty and his ambition. This invitation was reinforced by verbal messages delivered by a carefully selected emissary. The regents chose a figure with connections to both the royal court and the Douglas circle, someone whose presence would not arouse immediate suspicion. This messenger carried additional assurances beyond the written document, emphasizing the regent's desire for reconciliation and cooperation. He was instructed to suggest that the young king himself had expressed personal interest in meeting the famous Douglas brothers, adding an element that would be difficult for the status-conscious earl to resist. The document bore the Great Seal of Scotland, which Crichton controlled as Chancellor. This official seal represented the highest authority in the realm, transforming what might otherwise have been merely a social invitation into a formal royal summons. The inclusion of explicit safe conduct guarantees was particularly significant. Such guarantees were considered sacred in medieval political culture, their violation ranking among the most serious breaches of chivalric and legal norms. That Crichton was willing to violate this principle demonstrated the extraordinary nature of the threat he perceived in the Douglas brothers. While the invitation was being prepared, parallel preparations were underway within Edinburgh Castle. The Great Hall was designated as the location for the fateful dinner, a space that combined ceremonial grandeur with controlled access. Staff were selected carefully, with particular attention to those who would be present during the dinner itself. Trusted soldiers were positioned strategically throughout the castle, ready to act when signaled, but not so visible as to create alarm among the guests upon their arrival. These arrangements required careful coordination to maintain the appearance of a standard royal entertainment while preparing for a very different outcome. The menu for the dinner received similar attention. It needed to reflect the honor due to guests of the Douglases' stature, while also incorporating elements that would later take on symbolic significance. Contemporary accounts mention that a black bull's head was prepared as a dramatic centerpiece, though some historians debate whether this detail was added to later retellings of the event. In Scottish tradition, the presentation of a bull's head at a feast was widely understood as a symbol of death, a clear indication that treachery was at hand. Whether this element was planned from the beginning or represents historical embellishment, the meal was designed to initially impress the guests before serving as the setting for their downfall. The conspirators also prepared a facade of legal process to disguise what was essentially a predetermined execution. Documents were drafted charging the Douglas brothers with various offenses against the crown, accusations vague enough to be difficult to disprove, but serious enough to justify extreme measures. A group of loyal nobles was selected to constitute a jury that would pronounce judgment after a cursory hearing of these charges. This theatrical element was deemed necessary to maintain at least a thin veneer of legitimacy, particularly for how the events would be presented to the wider nobility and international observers afterward. The role of the young King James II in these preparations remains one of the most controversial aspects of the Black Dinner. At just 10 years old, James was old enough to be present at formal state occasions, but too young to exercise independent political judgment. Historical records suggest that he was informed that the Douglas brothers would be attending a feast in his honor, but he was almost certainly kept ignorant of the true intentions. Crichton and Livingston likely saw value in having the king present to enhance the occasion's legitimacy, while calculating that his youth would absolve him of responsibility for what would follow. Security arrangements for the event received meticulous attention. Plans were made to control who could enter and exit the castle once the Douglas party had arrived. The number of Douglas retainers who would be permitted to accompany the brothers into the castle itself was strictly limited, with the remainder to be accommodated in the town below. Weapons would be collected from all guests before entering the Great Hall, a common practice at royal entertainments, but one that would take on sinister significance in this context. Castle guards received special instructions regarding their positioning and potential responsibilities during the evening's events. The conspiracy expanded to include select members of the Scottish nobility whose support was deemed essential. These additions were made cautiously, with each new conspirator representing both an asset and a potential security risk. Those brought into the plot typically shared the regent's concerns about Douglas power or had personal grievances against the family. Some may have been promised portions of Douglas lands or offices following the planned executions. Others simply recognized that their own positions would be more secure with the Douglas threat removed. This wider circle was kept to the minimum necessary to ensure the plan's success. Historical records suggest that Bishop Kennedy of St. Andrews may have been among those aware of the plot. As one of Scotland's leading churchmen and a relative of the royal family, Kennedy represented an important source of moral and political legitimacy. His tacit approval, if indeed it was given, would have helped frame the planned killings as necessary acts of state rather than simple murders. The involvement of church authorities, even peripherally, reflected the conspirators' concern with how their actions would be perceived and judged by contemporaries and posterity. The plan included detailed consideration of the aftermath. Arrangements were made for royal forces to move quickly to secure key Douglas properties before news of the brothers' deaths could reach loyal Douglas retainers. Documents were prepared reassigning Douglas offices and revoking certain land grants, ready to be implemented immediately following the dinner. Diplomatic messages were drafted to explain the actions to foreign courts, particularly England, where Douglas connections might otherwise have prompted intervention. These preparations reflected the understanding that the moments following the executions would be critical in determining whether the gambit succeeded or failed. Contingency plans were also developed for various scenarios. The conspirators considered what would happen if the Douglas brothers arrived with a larger escort than anticipated, if they somehow learned of the plot beforehand, or if they resisted once inside the castle. Each possibility required specific responses to maintain control of the situation. The fact that these contingencies were never needed suggests both the thoroughness of the main plan and the complete surprise achieved by the conspirators. The most delicate aspect of the planning involved ensuring that the young Earl and his brother would attend without their full military retinue. Douglas travels typically involve scores of armed men, a force that could potentially overwhelm the castle guards if conflict erupted. The invitation specifically requested that the brothers come with only a modest escort, befitting a peaceful diplomatic visit. Additional messages emphasized that a large military presence might be misinterpreted as threatening, potentially undermining the goodwill the gathering was supposed to establish. These carefully phrased limitations aimed to leave the Douglas brothers vulnerable while avoiding arousing their suspicion. As November 24 approached, final preparations accelerated. Castle stores were stocked with appropriate provisions for a royal banquet. The Great Hall was prepared with decorations suitable for hosting distinguished guests. Guards rehearsed their positions and responsibilities. The selected nobles who would participate in the trial were confirmed and instructed on their roles. These practical arrangements proceeded alongside continuing assessment of intelligence regarding Douglas movements and intentions, with the conspirators ready to adjust their plans if new information warranted change. The level of secrecy maintained throughout these preparations was remarkable. In a society where political information typically spread through networks of servants, messengers, and observers, the core details of the plot remained confined to a small circle of conspirators. This achievement speaks to both the disciplined communications employed by Crichton and his allies, and the seriousness with which all involved viewed the Douglas threat. Each participant understood that premature disclosure would not only doom the plan, but likely led to their own destruction once Douglas vengeance was unleashed. Whether driven by pragmatic political calculation or personal animosity, the architects of the Black Dinner had now committed themselves to a course from which there could be no retreat. The violation of safe conduct, the execution of nobles without proper trial, the killing of youths who had not yet had opportunity to commit serious offenses, all represented transgressions of medieval political norms that would shock contemporaries. That Crichton and Livingston were willing to accept these costs demonstrates their assessment of the Douglas threat as existential, requiring extraordinary measures beyond conventional political competition. As word reached Edinburgh that the Douglas brothers had accepted the invitation and were preparing to travel to the capital, the trap was set. Castle servants made final preparations for receiving distinguished guests. Guards took their assigned positions. The conspirators reviewed their roles one last time. The machinery of hospitality was ready to serve as the mechanism of execution. All now depended on whether the young Earl of Douglas and his brother would indeed arrive as expected, with the limited escort specified in the invitation. Their journey toward Edinburgh was a journey toward a fate they could not imagine, orchestrated by men who had concluded that their political survival required the extinction of Scotland's most powerful noble lineage. The plan for the Black Dinner represented a calculated gamble with potentially enormous consequences. If successful, it would remove the most significant check on the regent's authority and dramatically alter the power dynamics of Scottish politics. If it failed, or if its execution triggered widespread noble resistance, it could plunge Scotland into civil war. As November 24th, 1440, dawned, the conspirators could only wait to see whether their elaborate preparations would achieve their intended purpose or unleash forces beyond their control. The young Douglas brothers, meanwhile, continued their journey toward Edinburgh, carrying with them the written guarantee of royal protection that would prove to be their death warrant. Dawn broke over the Scottish borders on a crisp November morning as the Douglas traveling party prepared for the final leg of their journey to Edinburgh. The young Earl William and his brother David had departed from Threave Castle several days earlier, traveling with a significantly reduced escort as requested in the royal invitation. Their procession was still impressive by ordinary standards. Perhaps 40 men, including household knights, personal servants, and a small contingent of armed guards, but represented only a fraction of the military strength typically at the Douglas brothers' disposal. This limitation, which would prove fatally consequential, had been accepted without serious question, a testament to the perceived sanctity of the royal safe conduct they carried. The journey from their southwestern strongholds had taken them through Douglas territories, where they had been received with the deference due to their rank. Local lords had offered hospitality along the route, and common people had gathered to glimpse the famous brothers as they passed. These receptions had reinforced William's sense of his family's importance, and the respect they commanded throughout southern Scotland. Each warm welcome had further solidified his confidence that his position in the kingdom was secure, a confidence that left little room for suspicion. Regarding the invitation to Edinburgh, as they rode, the brothers likely discussed the upcoming meeting with the young king and his regents. Contemporary accounts suggest that William viewed the invitation as recognition of his rightful place in the governance of Scotland. At 16, he had been managing his vast estates for 2 years and likely felt ready to take on the wider responsibilities that historically had belonged to the Douglas Earls. His 12-year-old brother David, still very much under William's influence, shared this optimistic perspective, perhaps viewing the royal summons as an adventure and an opportunity to experience the grandeur of court life at Edinburgh Castle. The reduced size of their escort reflected not just compliance with the invitation's terms, but also the brothers' assessment that this journey represented a diplomatic rather than military undertaking. They traveled as nobles answering a royal summons, not as warlords anticipating conflict. Their finest clothes were packed for the banquet, and gifts had been prepared for the young king, traditional expressions of respect from vassal to monarch. The formal letter of safe conduct, bearing the Great Seal of Scotland, was carried prominently, its parchment and wax embodying the solemn promise of royal protection. Weather conditions for the journey had been favorable by November standards, with clear skies, though increasingly cold temperatures as they moved northward. The party followed established routes, crossing rivers at known fords and stopping at settlements where arrangements for food and lodging had been made in advance. Their progress was steady but unhurried, befitting the dignity of their rank and creating an impression of confidence and security. No scouts were sent ahead to assess potential dangers, no special precautions taken beyond those standard for noble travel in medieval Scotland. As they approached Edinburgh, the landscape changed noticeably. The rolling hills of the borders gave way to more populated areas, with farmlands, villages, and eventually the outskirts of Scotland's growing capital. Edinburgh, in 1440, was a city of perhaps 12,000 inhabitants, its footprint still largely confined to the defensive ridge stretching from the Castle Rock down to Holyrood. The High Street formed the spine of the city, lined with wooden structures, housing merchants, craftsmen, and the lower nobility. Stone buildings, markers of wealth and permanence, were largely limited to religious establishments and the homes of the most prominent citizens. Rising above this urban landscape, Edinburgh Castle dominated the horizon. Its stone walls perched atop the sheer volcanic rock that had made it a natural fortress since prehistoric times. As the Douglas party drew closer, this imposing structure would have commanded their attention, its towers and battlements representing both royal authority and, unbeknownst to them, the trap that awaited. The castle's position combined natural and human defenses to create a nearly impregnable stronghold, with a single controlled approach that funneled visitors through a series of gates and guard posts. Word of the Douglas brothers' approach had reached the castle well before their arrival. Crichton's network of informants had tracked their progress from the moment they left Freve, providing regular updates on their location, the size of their escort, and their expected arrival time. This intelligence allowed the conspirators to make final adjustments to their preparations, confirming that the brothers were indeed traveling with the limited retinue requested and showing no signs of suspicion. Guards at the city gates had been instructed to receive the Douglas party with appropriate ceremony, while noting exactly who accompanied the young Earl and his brother. As the Douglas brothers and their entourage entered Edinburgh, they likely encountered expressions of public curiosity mixed with respect. The Douglas name was well known throughout Scotland, inspiring admiration, fear, or resentment depending on individual circumstances and allegiances. Some observers would have noted the unusual modesty of their escort for nobles of such prominence. Others might have speculated about the purpose of their visit, though few, if any, would have guessed the true intentions of those waiting at the castle. The general population of Edinburgh, focused on their daily concerns, could not have known they were witnessing the final public appearance of the Douglas brothers. The approach to Edinburgh Castle involved a steady climb up the Royal Mile, the main thoroughfare that connected the Palace of Holyrood to the castle. This route took the Douglas party through the heart of the city, where markets operated and civic life centered. The street would have been crowded with traders, craftsmen, clerics, and common laborers going about their business, creating a vibrant if somewhat chaotic scene. For security reasons, the Douglas escort would have moved in tight formation through these crowds, creating a visible procession that announced their identity and status to all observers. Upon reaching the castle esplanade, the open area before the main gate, the Douglas party was met by a formal welcoming committee. Historical records suggest that this reception was led by Sir William Crichton himself, who emerged from the castle with a group of officials and servants. The Chancellor greeted the young Earl with elaborate courtesy, expressing the King's pleasure at their acceptance of his invitation and assuring them of the warm welcome that awaited inside. This personal reception by such a high official would have appeared as an appropriate honor for guests of their rank, while allowing Crichton to assess the brothers and their escort firsthand. The formalities of entry then began, a process designed to separate the Douglas brothers from much of their protective entourage. Castle protocol, ostensibly for the king's security, required that only a limited number of personal attendants could accompany noble visitors into the royal presence. The majority of the Douglas escort was directed to accommodations in the town below, with assurances that they would be well provided for during their lord's audience at the castle. This standard procedure, which might otherwise have raised concerns, appeared natural in the context of a royal summons and formal banquet. Only a handful of personal servants and 2 senior Douglas retainers were permitted to accompany the brothers into the castle itself. The main gate, a massive wooden structure reinforced with iron, opened to admit this reduced party, then closed firmly behind them. They proceeded through the castle's defensive layers, passing additional guardhouses and portcullises, each transition further isolating them from potential assistance and placing them more completely under Crichton's control. These progressive security measures, while ostensibly normal components of royal castle design, effectively served the conspirators' purpose of rendering their guests vulnerable. According to contemporary accounts, the brothers surrendered their weapons upon entering the main castle compound, a customary practice when attending royal functions. Their remaining attendants were gradually separated from them through various pretexts: the need to arrange quarters, to prepare the brothers' formal attire, to attend to their horses. By the time William and David Douglas were escorted to the chambers prepared for their use, they were accompanied by only their closest personal servants, effectively isolated within the most secure royal fortress in Scotland. Their reception chambers were appropriately luxurious, furnished with the best accommodations the castle could provide. Refreshments awaited them, along with assistance in preparing for the evening's banquet. Every element of their treatment reinforced the impression that they were honored guests rather than targets of a deadly conspiracy. Servants attended to their needs with practiced deference, while carefully observing and reporting their conversations and movements to Crichton's agents. The brothers, accustomed to such treatment, likely noticed nothing amiss in these arrangements. During the afternoon hours before the banquet, the young king himself may have briefly greeted his guests. James II, then only 10 years old, had been carefully coached regarding his role in the evening's events. Most historians believe he was kept ignorant of the true purpose of the dinner, told only that important nobles were visiting, and that he was to treat them with royal courtesy. This encounter, if it occurred, would have further disarmed any lingering suspicions the Douglas brothers might have harbored. The presence of the child king personified the royal authority, whose protection they believed they enjoyed. As evening approached, the atmosphere within the castle intensified. Servants moved with increasing purpose, making final preparations for the banquet. Guards shifted positions according to predetermined plans, ensuring that key locations were secured and escape routes blocked. The conspirators gathered privately for last consultations, confirming signals and sequences for the events to come. Throughout these preparations, care was taken to maintain the appearance of a standard royal entertainment, with nothing to alert the Douglas brothers to the danger they faced. The great hall of Edinburgh Castle was illuminated by torches and candles as darkness fell, their light reflecting off tapestries and polished wood. Long tables had been arranged according to strict protocols of precedence, with the high table on a dais at the hall's end reserved for the king, the Douglas brothers, and the highest-ranking nobles present. Musicians were positioned to provide entertainment throughout the meal, their presence adding to the festive atmosphere, while also covering any unusual sounds or movements. Servers stood ready with the first courses, their formal livery contributing to the occasion's dignity. When the Douglas brothers entered this carefully prepared scene, they would have observed all the elements of a proper royal banquet. The hall was filled with notable figures of the Scottish court, many of whom rose respectfully as they approached. The young king was seated at the center of the high table, flanked by positions clearly reserved for the guests of honor. Crichton, as chancellor and host, greeted them with elaborate courtesy, personally escorting them to their places near the king. Every detail conveyed respect for their rank and appreciation for their attendance. The brothers' attire for the banquet reflected their status as Scotland's premier nobles. Contemporary accounts describe William wearing the insignia of his earldom, and both brothers dressed in the finest materials available: velvet, silk, and fur, appropriate to their rank. They likely wore some Douglas emblems as well, visual reminders of their family's prominence. Their youth was apparent, William at 16, still showing the transition from boy to man, David at 12, clearly still a child. But they carried themselves with the confidence of those born to power and raised to exercise it. As they took their places at the high table, the Douglas brothers represented the culmination of generations of family, ambition, and achievement. Their presence in Edinburgh Castle, seated beside the king, would have appeared to confirm their central place in Scotland's power structure. The elaborate courtesy with which they were treated, the deference shown by lesser nobles, the apparent honor of their reception, all seemed to validate their family's status and importance. They had entered the castle as confident young aristocrats, secure in their position and certain of their future. They could not know that they were already effectively prisoners, their fate sealed by plans set in motion weeks before. The first courses of the banquet were served amid general conversation and the music of harps and flutes. Wine flowed freely, and the initial atmosphere was one of convivial celebration. The young king engaged with his guests, as he had been instructed, asking questions about their lands and activities that the brothers would have happily answered. Crackling and other conspirators maintained the facade of hospitable attention, ensuring that no hint of their intentions disturbed the carefully constructed illusion of a harmonious gathering. For a brief time, the black dinner proceeded like any other formal royal entertainment. As the meal progressed, however, subtle shifts began to occur. Observers noted increased movement among certain guards and officials. Key conspirators exchanged glances and discreet signals. The nature of the conversations at the high table turned gradually toward matters of state authority and noble obligations. Those aware of the plot felt the tension building toward the predetermined moment when hospitality would give way to its opposite. The Douglas brothers, focused on the immediate experience of royal favor and seemingly untroubled by premonition, continued to eat, drink, and converse, unaware that they were participating in their own funeral feast. The precise timing had been planned carefully, allowing sufficient opportunity for the charade of normal hospitality, while ensuring that the subsequent actions could be completed efficiently. As servants prepared to bring forth a new course, a moment approached that would transform a royal banquet into one of history's most notorious acts of treachery. The black dinner was about to reveal its true nature, with consequences that would reverberate through Scottish history for generations to come. The banquet was well underway, with multiple courses already served, and the atmosphere in Edinburgh Castle's great hall seemingly convivial. Laughter occasionally rose above the general murmur of conversation and the soft strains of music. The young Douglas brothers, seated in positions of honor near the king, had been lulled into complete comfort by the elaborate hospitality and apparent goodwill of their hosts. The initial tension that might naturally accompany such a significant meeting had dissolved as wine flowed and conversation remained cordial. To all outward appearances, this was simply another state occasion, a formal dinner bringing together Scotland's young monarch and representatives of the realm's most powerful noble family. The meal itself was lavish, befitting an event hosted by the crown for guests of such high status. Servants had presented course after course of the finest foods available: venison and wild boar, imported spices, fresh bread, and seasonal fruits. Wine had been poured generously throughout the evening, with special attention paid to ensuring the Douglas brothers' cups remained full. The young king, limited to watered wine appropriate for his age, participated in the toasts and conversations with the careful formality of a child who has been thoroughly coached on his responsibilities. James II, despite his youth, displayed the composure expected of a monarch. Seated at the center of the high table, he formed the visual and symbolic focus of the gathering. His distinctive birthmark, the reddish blotch on his face, that had earned him the nickname Fiery Face was clearly visible in the torchlight. The 10-year-old king spoke when prompted and listened attentively to his guests, particularly when William Douglas shared stories of hunting expeditions and border skirmishes that appealed to a boy's sense of adventure. The king's genuine interest in these tales helped maintain the brothers' belief that the invitation had been extended in good faith. Throughout the early stages of the banquet, Crichton had played the role of gracious host with practiced skill. As Chancellor and Keeper of Edinburgh Castle, he supervised the proceedings with apparent concern for his guests' comfort and enjoyment. He proposed toasts to the health of the king and the prosperity of the realm, sentiments with which none present could disagree. His conversation touched on neutral topics: the changing weather, recent hunts, minor court gossip, avoiding any hint of the political tensions that actually defined relations between the Regency government and the House of Douglas. Other conspirators were strategically positioned throughout the hall. Alexander Livingston sat further down the high table, participating in the performance of normality while carefully observing the Douglas brothers. Selected nobles who had been brought into the plot occupied places where they could assist if resistance occurred. Castle guards maintained positions near doorways and at intervals along the walls, their presence justified by normal security protocols, but their numbers and alertness subtly increased beyond usual levels. This careful choreography ensured that when the moment came, the transition from feast to confrontation could occur swiftly and decisively. Conversation at the high table gradually shifted toward matters of governance and the role of nobility in supporting the crown. Crichton, with practiced diplomatic skill, introduced these topics through flattering references to Douglas history and traditions of service to Scottish kings. The young Earl responded with appropriate expressions of loyalty, while subtly asserting his family's special status and hereditary rights. This verbal sparring, though outwardly polite, contained the underlying tensions that had led to this fatal gathering: the crown's desire to assert centralized authority and the Douglases' determination to maintain their traditional independence. As the meal progressed toward its later stages, subtle changes began to occur in the hall's atmosphere. The music shifted to slower, more somber melodies. Servants not directly involved in the conspiracy noticed increased activity among the guards, though they had been warned against commenting on any unusual proceedings. Some later accounts suggest that certain nobles not involved in the plot began to sense that something extraordinary was about to happen, noting changes in Crichton's demeanor and unusual patterns of movement around the hall's perimeter. If the Douglas brothers noticed these shifts, they gave no indication, continuing to enjoy what they still perceived as an honor bestowed upon them. Then came the moment that would be immortalized in Scottish historical memory. At a signal from Crichton, the hall's main doors swung open to admit servants carrying a large covered platter. The room fell silent as this final course was borne ceremoniously toward the high table. With theatrical timing, the cover was removed to reveal the severed head of a black bull, its dead eyes staring vacantly, its horns still intact, blood congealed around its neck. This grim centerpiece was placed directly before the Douglas brothers, its significance unmistakable to anyone familiar with Scottish traditions. The presentation of a bull's head was widely understood throughout Scotland as a symbol of death, specifically a declaration that execution was imminent. It was an ancient custom, dating back to Celtic times, that had maintained its symbolic power through centuries of cultural evolution. In that moment, the pretense of hospitality was shattered. The true purpose of the gathering stood revealed, embodied in this grotesque warning that came too late to serve as anything but an announcement of fate already sealed. Contemporary accounts describe William Douglas's face transforming from confusion to comprehension to outrage within moments. At 16, the young Earl had the presence of mind to recognize both the symbol's meaning and the magnitude of the betrayal it represented. He reportedly rose to his feet, his hand instinctively reaching for a sword that had been taken from him hours earlier. His brother David, younger and perhaps less immediately understanding of their situation, looked to William with growing alarm, the child's expression shifting from bewilderment to fear as he registered his brother's reaction. "What is the meaning of this?" William demanded, his voice cutting through the silence that had fallen over the hall. The question was directed at Crichton, but his eyes moved between the Chancellor and the young king, perhaps still hoping that this was some misunderstanding or test that could be resolved. The bull's head, however, admitted no ambiguity, and the movements of guards closing in from the hall's perimeter confirmed that what was unfolding was no mere theatrical threat. Crichton rose from his seat, assuming the formal posture of his office as Chancellor. "William Douglas, Earl of Douglas, and David Douglas," he proclaimed in a voice practiced in the delivery of official pronouncements, "you stand accused of offenses against the crown and the peace of this realm. The specific charges, as recorded by later chroniclers, included conspiracy against royal authority, formation of illegal bonds and alliances with other nobles, communication with enemies of the realm, and usurpation of royal prerogatives within Douglas territories." The exact words may have varied in different accounts, but the substance remained consistent. The Douglases were accused of using their enormous power to undermine royal governance and create what amounted to an independent state within Scotland. These charges, however vague and difficult to substantiate, provided the legal pretext for what was fundamentally a political elimination. Crichton continued with the formal declaration that a council of nobles had considered these matters and determined that the security of the realm required immediate action against the accused. William Douglas, displaying the courage and quick thinking that might have made him a formidable political player had he lived, denounced the proceedings as a mockery of justice. "We came here under the king's safe conduct and protection," he reportedly declared, pulling from his tunic the document bearing the royal seal that had guaranteed his safety. He appealed directly to the young king, perhaps recognizing James as his only potential ally in the room, though one without actual power to intervene. Contemporary accounts suggest that the Earl's defiance impressed even some of those who had agreed to his elimination, his youth and bravery standing in stark contrast to the duplicity of his accusers. The young King James, witnessing events he had not been prepared for, reportedly became distressed as he began to understand what was happening. Various chronicles describe him protesting, crying, or attempting to order a halt to the proceedings. "Stop this, I command you," the 10-year-old king is said to have shouted, rising from his seat in an attempt to assert authority he did not actually possess. His protests were gently but firmly ignored by Crichton and the other adults who controlled the situation. Some accounts suggest that Livingston physically restrained the king from further intervention, while others indicate that James was simply escorted from the hall by attendants instructed to remove him before the final acts of the drama. With the king removed from the scene, any pretense of legal proceedings quickly gave way to the predetermined outcome. Guards moved forward to seize the Douglas brothers, who found themselves surrounded, unarmed, and without allies in a room filled with enemies. Some accounts describe a brief struggle, with the teenage Earl attempting to fight his captors, despite the hopelessness of his situation. His younger brother David, only 12 years old, reportedly clung to William in terror, unable to comprehend fully the fate that awaited them but understanding that they faced mortal danger. The brothers were forcibly removed from the great hall, taken not to a prison cell, but directly to the castle courtyard, where hasty preparations for execution had been made. The speed of these events suggests that the conspirators feared any delay might allow opposition to organize, or royal intervention to be arranged. From the brothers' entrance into the great hall to their removal for execution, perhaps only 2 hours had elapsed, the duration of a banquet that had transformed without warning from an honor to a death sentence. Details of the execution itself vary in different historical accounts. Some describe a formal beheading on a block, others a cruder execution by axe or sword. What is consistent across accounts is that the brothers were killed in quick succession, with minimal ceremony and no opportunity for final statements beyond their protests of the injustice being committed. William, as the Earl and elder brother, was executed first, perhaps forced to witness his younger brother's terror before facing his own death. David, a child not yet in his teens, reportedly died pleading for mercy that would not be granted. The entire process violated virtually every norm of medieval justice. Nobles of their rank would typically be entitled to trial by their peers, with formal procedures and opportunities for defense. Even if found guilty of treason, a peer might expect imprisonment rather than immediate execution, particularly given their youth. Most egregiously, the violation of safe conduct represented a breach of one of the most fundamental principles of medieval political interaction. This protection, once granted under royal seal, was supposed to be inviolable, its sanctity essential for the functioning of a society where travel always involved vulnerability. The young king's role in these events would later become a matter of historical debate. Some chronicles portray James II as a helpless witness, a child used to provide royal sanction for actions he neither understood nor approved. Others suggest he was more aware of the plot, but was convinced by his adult advisors of its necessity for his own security. The psychological impact on the 10-year-old boy must have been significant, witnessing such violence carried out in his name against guests who had been seated at his own table moments before. This experience would arguably influence his later approach to governance and his eventual personal campaign against the Douglas family when he assumed full royal powers. As night fell over Edinburgh Castle, the bodies of William and David Douglas lay in the courtyard, their blood-staining stones that had witnessed centuries of Scottish history. Inside the great hall, the remains of the banquet stood abandoned, the black bull's head still in place as a grim testament to Scottish traditions of symbolism and betrayal. The conspirators gathered to confirm their next steps, aware that they had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. They had eliminated the most immediate threat to their authority, but in doing so had committed an act that would shock contemporaries and echo through Scottish history for centuries to come. The Black Dinner had claimed its victims, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. News of the executions spread through Edinburgh Castle with the swiftness of whispered horror. Servants who had witnessed the brothers' removal from the great hall passed urgent messages to colleagues. Guards who had participated spoke in hushed tones of what they had seen. By midnight, every person within the castle walls knew that the Earl of Douglas and his brother had been put to death. Many undoubtedly feared that they too might face consequences if they revealed their knowledge, creating an atmosphere of tense silence punctuated by furtive communications. The initial shock was compounded by the violation of hospitality, a principle so fundamental to medieval Scottish culture that its breach seemed almost sacrilegious. Outside the castle, in the town below, information traveled more slowly, but with increasing momentum. The Douglas retainers who had been accommodated in various inns and lodging houses sensed that something was amiss when expected communications from their lords failed to arrive. Some attempted to approach the castle, but found the gates firmly closed, with guards refusing entry or explanation. Rumors began to circulate, initially vague but growing more specific as the night progressed. By dawn, the terrible truth had reached those most directly affected, the Douglas men who had accompanied their lords to Edinburgh, only to lose them to treachery. The immediate reaction of these retainers revealed the precariousness of the conspirators' position. Though they had succeeded in eliminating the Douglas brothers, Crichton and Livingston now faced the potential consequences of their actions. The Douglas men, though reduced in number as planned, still constituted a significant armed force within Edinburgh. Their first impulse was reportedly to storm the castle and avenge their murdered lords. Several contemporary accounts describe hurried councils among Douglas knights, with heated debates about their best course of action. Their emotional desire for immediate vengeance competed with practical recognition of the castle's impregnability and concern for their own survival. Ultimately, self-preservation prevailed. The Douglas retainers, recognizing their vulnerable position deep in territory controlled by their lord's killers, opted for strategic withdrawal rather than suicidal assault. They gathered their possessions and departed Edinburgh with remarkable speed, riding hard for Douglas territories where they could spread the news and organize a more effective response. Their journey south was tense, with constant vigilance against potential pursuit or ambush. Some accounts suggest they split into smaller groups to improve their chances of at least some messengers reaching Douglas strongholds with news of the disaster. Inside the castle, Crichton moved quickly to consolidate the apparent victory. The bodies of the Douglas brothers were disposed of without ceremony, denied the dignified burial that would normally be accorded to nobles of their rank. Documents were prepared announcing the executions as legitimate acts of royal justice against traitors to the crown. Messengers were dispatched to key allies throughout the kingdom, providing the official version of events and calling for support against potential Douglas retaliation. The young king, reportedly still distressed by what he had witnessed, was closely monitored to ensure he could not communicate independently with anyone outside the conspirators' circle. The immediate aftermath revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the conspirators' planning. They had successfully eliminated the Douglas brothers and maintained control of Edinburgh Castle and the royal administration. However, they had miscalculated the speed with which news would spread and underestimated the emotional impact of their violation of safe conduct. The act that they had intended to present as legitimate royal justice was widely perceived, even by those with no particular loyalty to the Douglases, as a dishonorable breach of fundamental principles. This perception would complicate their efforts to stabilize the political situation in the days and weeks that followed. As news of the Black Dinner reached Douglas territories, the reaction was predictably one of shock, grief, and rage. At Thrieve Castle, the Douglas stronghold in Galloway, the family supporters gathered to mourn their murdered lords and consider their response. The emotional impact was particularly severe because of the brothers' youth and the manner of their deaths. William, at 16, had barely begun to exercise his inheritance. David, at 12, had been little more than a child. Their execution without proper trial, after being guaranteed royal protection, struck contemporaries as an act that transgressed both legal and moral boundaries. The question of succession immediately became central to the Douglas response. With both William and David dead without heirs, the title and estates passed to their great-uncle, James Douglas, known as James the Gross for his corpulent physique. Already an elderly man by medieval standards, James had not expected to inherit the earldom and had maintained somewhat distant relations with the main branch of the family. His succession represented both continuity, in that Douglas lands remained under Douglas control, and disruption, as he brought different priorities and relationships to his unexpected position as head of Scotland's most powerful noble house. The new Earl of Douglas faced difficult decisions regarding how to respond to his grandnephew's murders. Immediate military action against the crown would traditionally be expected to avenge such a betrayal. However, direct confrontation with royal authority, even when exercised by regents rather than the king himself, carried significant risks, both practical and ideological. The Douglas position had always been based on a complex balance of independent power and nominal loyalty to the crown. Outright rebellion might undermine the legitimacy that the family had carefully cultivated through generations of ostensible royal service. James the Gross ultimately chose a more measured approach than might have been expected. Rather than launching immediate attacks against royal holdings, he focused on consolidating his control over Douglas territories and building alliances with other noble families who had been disturbed by the regent's actions. This restraint may have reflected his age and temperament, the practical difficulties of organizing major military operations during winter, or strategic calculation about the longer-term interests of the Douglas family. Whatever his reasoning, his response denied Crichton and Livingston the opportunity to present themselves as defenders against Douglas aggression. In Edinburgh and Stirling, the regents moved to justify their actions to the wider Scottish political community. Official communications emphasized the threat allegedly posed by the Douglas brothers to royal authority and the security of the realm. Specific accusations were kept deliberately vague, focusing on generalized claims of treason and conspiracy rather than detailed allegations that might be refuted. The executions were presented as regrettable but necessary measures taken to protect the young king and preserve the proper order of governance during his minority. These justifications convinced some, particularly those who had long been uncomfortable with Douglas power, but failed to persuade many others. The reaction among the broader Scottish nobility was mixed but predominantly negative. Even families that had no particular love for the Douglases were disturbed by the precedent set by the Black Dinner. If safe conduct guaranteed under the royal seal could be violated for political convenience, no noble could feel secure when traveling to court or engaging in negotiations. The summary execution of peers without proper trial likewise threatened the privileges that all nobles considered their birthright. These concerns transcended specific allegiances, touching on the fundamental security of the aristocracy as a class. International reactions further complicated the regent's position. The Scottish kingdom maintained important relationships with several European powers, particularly France, its traditional ally against England, and the Vatican. Diplomatic communications from these entities expressed concern about the manner of the executions and raised questions about the stability of Scottish governance. More immediately troubling for the regents, English authorities along the border increased their vigilance, concerned that Douglas supporters might seek alliances across the frontier or that general instability in Scotland might create security threats. Among ordinary Scots, reactions to the Black Dinner varied by region and circumstance. In areas traditionally under Douglas influence, the predominant response was outrage, with local ballads and stories quickly emerging to memorialize the murdered brothers and condemn their killers. In regions where royal authority was stronger, or where Douglas power had been resented, there was more willingness to accept the official justification. Urban populations, particularly in Edinburgh, expressed unease about the violation of hospitality, regardless of their political alignments, seeing it as a transgression of values fundamental to social order. The young king's position in these events remained ambiguous. James II, at 10 years old, lacked the authority to contradict his regents or hold them accountable for actions taken in his name. Contemporary chronicles suggest that he remained distressed by what he had witnessed, potentially developing a deep-seated mistrust of his advisors. However, he was carefully isolated from anyone who might encourage independent thinking or action. His education and daily routine continued under strict supervision, with all external communications monitored and controlled. The psychological impact of the Black Dinner on his development can only be inferred from his later actions as an adult king. Within weeks of the executions, it became clear that the conspirators' hopes for a simple resolution to the Douglas problem had been unfulfilled. While they had eliminated William and David Douglas, they had not significantly diminished Douglas' power or territorial control. The new Earl, though less aggressive than they might have feared, maintained the family's essential position in southern Scotland. Moreover, the manner of the brothers' deaths had created a moral cloud over the Regency government, complicating its relations with both domestic and international partners. What had been conceived as a decisive stroke against an existential threat had instead introduced new complications and challenges. Livingston and Crackling, nonetheless, worked to extract maximum advantage from the situation. Royal writs were issued confiscating certain Douglas properties deemed particularly significant for royal authority. Officials loyal to the regents were appointed to key positions in border regions previously dominated by Douglas influence. Efforts were made to cultivate relationships with Scottish nobles who might be persuaded to fill the power vacuum in areas where Douglas control had been weakened. These administrative maneuvers achieved some limited success, but fell far short of the comprehensive reduction in Douglas influence that the regents had hoped to achieve. The broader governance of Scotland continued under the uneasy partnership between Crichton and Livingston, their mutual suspicion temporarily subordinated to their shared vulnerability following the Black Dinner. The young king remained primarily at Stirling under Livingston's supervision, while Crichton controlled the administrative apparatus from Edinburgh. This arrangement, always based more on necessity than trust, became increasingly strained as each man sought to position himself advantageously for the inevitable next phase of their competition. The elimination of the Douglas brothers as a common threat had removed one of the primary factors holding their alliance together. As winter gave way to spring in 1441, the immediate crisis triggered by the Black Dinner began to subside into a new normal of Scottish politics. The executions had not triggered the civil war that some had feared, nor completely transformed the power dynamics of the kingdom. Instead, they had added new layers of complexity to already complicated relationships, created new grievances to be addressed or exploited, and established a precedent that would influence political calculations for years to come. The fundamental tensions between central royal authority and regional magnate power remained unresolved, merely reconfigured around different personalities and specific issues. For the Douglas family, the Black Dinner became a defining moment in their historical narrative, a martyrdom that would be remembered and invoked for generations. The murdered brothers were memorialized in family chronicles and local traditions. Their youth and the treachery of their deaths emphasized to maximum emotional effect. James the Gross, and later his son William, who would become the 8th Earl, used this narrative effectively to maintain family solidarity and justify their sometimes contentious relationships with the crown. The Black Dinner thus entered Douglas mythology as both a tragedy and a rallying point, a wound that demanded eventual healing or vengeance. For Scottish society more broadly, the events of November 1440 entered cultural memory as an exemplar of treachery and the violation of sacred principles. Ballads and stories circulated that emphasized the youth of the victims, the sacred nature of hospitality, and the shocking breach of safe conduct. These narratives typically simplified the complex political calculations involved, presenting the episode as a morality tale about honor and betrayal, rather than a calculated act of state. Through these cultural representations, the Black Dinner acquired significance beyond its immediate political context, becoming a reference point for discussions of loyalty, betrayal, and the ethics of governance. As 1441 progressed, the immediate shock of the Black Dinner gradually gave way to the ongoing processes of political negotiation, alliance building, and occasional conflict that characterized medieval Scottish governance. The executions had not resolved the fundamental tensions between crown and nobility, but had instead reconfigured them in ways that would continue to shape Scottish politics for decades to come. The young king continued to grow toward the age when he would assume personal rule, observing and learning from the adults who currently wielded power in his name. The seeds were being planted for the next phase of the struggle between royal authority and aristocratic power, a struggle that would eventually lead to James II's personal campaign against the very Douglas power that Crichton and Livingston had failed to break through their infamous act of treachery. The reverberations of the Black Dinner extended far beyond the immediate political crisis it triggered. As the decades passed, this singular event transformed from a contemporary scandal into a defining moment in Scottish historical memory, a story that would be told and retold across generations. The execution of the Douglas brothers became more than just another episode in Scotland's turbulent medieval politics. It evolved into a cultural touchstone, a cautionary tale about power, betrayal, and the fragility of trust in political relationships. To understand the full significance of the Black Dinner, we must trace its long-term impact on Scottish history and its enduring place in cultural memory. The most immediate historical consequence was its effect on the relationship between the Scottish crown and the House of Douglas. What Crichton and Livingston had intended as a decisive blow against Douglas power instead initiated a complex, decades-long struggle that would only reach its conclusion during James II's personal rule. The Black Dinner had eliminated two individuals, but had not fundamentally weakened the structural power of the Douglas family, which remained rooted in vast landholdings, extensive kinship networks, and generations of accumulated authority. If anything, the manner of the brothers' deaths had provided the Douglases with a powerful narrative of victimhood and righteous grievance that strengthened family solidarity and justified future resistance to royal authority. When James II assumed personal rule in the late 1440s, he inherited a kingdom still shaped by the consequences of actions taken in his name during his childhood. The young king, who had witnessed the Black Dinner at age 10, had been profoundly affected by the experience. Historical records suggest that as he matured, James developed a complex perspective on the event, recognizing the problematic nature of the betrayal while also internalizing the regent's concerns about unchecked magnate power. This ambivalence would inform his own approach to governance, combining sincere efforts at reconciliation with an underlying conviction that royal authority must ultimately prevail over aristocratic independence. For several years after assuming personal rule, James II attempted to work with the Douglas family, now led by William Douglas, the 8th Earl, son of James the Gross. The king confirmed Douglas privileges, included Douglas representatives in his councils, and even developed a personal friendship with the young earl, who was close to him in age. This period of reconciliation suggested that the wounds of the Black Dinner might eventually heal through pragmatic cooperation. However, beneath the surface, fundamental tensions remained unresolved. The king's determination to assert centralized authority clashed with the Douglases' equally firm commitment to maintaining their traditional autonomy. These tensions erupted dramatically in 1452, when James II personally stabbed the 8th Earl of Douglas to death during an argument at Stirling Castle. This shocking act, which eerily mirrored the Black Dinner in its violation of safe conduct and disregard for proper legal process, demonstrated that the fundamental issues raised in 1440 remained unresolved. The king's action triggered the open conflict with the Douglas family that Crichton and Livingston had anticipated but failed to prevent through their earlier treachery. Between 1452 and 1455, James waged a determined campaign that ultimately succeeded where the regents had failed, breaking Douglas power permanently through military force, legal procedures, and strategic alliance building. The fall of the Black Douglases in 1455 represented the delayed fulfillment of the objectives behind the Black Dinner. Royal authority had finally prevailed over the semi-independent power of Scotland's greatest magnate family, establishing a precedent for centralized governance that would influence Scottish political development for generations. However, the fact that this outcome required 15 years, a personal murder committed by the king, and a full-scale military campaign suggests that the Black Dinner itself had been a strategic failure, an act too limited in scope to achieve its ambitious goals, yet too extreme in method to be politically sustainable. Beyond its direct political consequences, the Black Dinner exerted a lasting influence on Scottish legal and diplomatic practices. The shocking violation of safe conduct created heightened awareness of the need for reliable guarantees when negotiating across political divides. Subsequent Scottish monarchs took particular care to establish the inviolability of their protection, recognizing that their credibility in this regard directly affected their ability to govern effectively. Legal procedures for trying nobles accused of treason were gradually formalized, reducing the possibility of summary executions like those of the Douglas brothers. These developments did not prevent all future abuses of power, but they created stronger institutional safeguards against the most flagrant violations of aristocratic privilege. The Black Dinner also affected Scottish cultural attitudes toward hospitality, reinforcing its sacred character while highlighting the terrible consequences of its violation. Medieval Scottish society, like many traditional cultures, placed enormous emphasis on the obligations of hosts toward guests. The betrayal at Edinburgh Castle was perceived not merely as a political crime, but as a transgression against fundamental social values. This perception helped ensure that the story would be preserved and transmitted across generations, not just as historical information, but as a moral lesson about the boundaries of acceptable behavior even in the pursuit of political objectives. The revulsion felt by contemporaries echoed through centuries of Scottish cultural memory. As the immediate participants faded from living memory, the Black Dinner gradually transformed from recent scandal to historical legend. Chroniclers of the 15th and 16th centuries recorded versions of the event that emphasized its dramatic elements, the youth and innocence of the victims, the symbolism of the bull's head, the violation of sacred hospitality. These accounts often simplified the complex political calculations involved, presenting the episode as a morality tale of good versus evil, rather than a calculated act of state power. Through this process of narrative refinement, the Black Dinner acquired the clarity and emotional resonance that would ensure its cultural persistence. The story found particularly fertile ground in the ballad tradition that flourished in the Scottish borders. These narrative poems, transmitted orally and later collected by antiquarians, preserved historical memories in forms accessible to largely illiterate populations. Ballads about the Black Dinner typically emphasized the youth of the Douglas brothers, the treachery of their hosts, and the violation of sacred principles. They served both as entertainment and as vehicles for cultural values, reinforcing community standards regarding hospitality, honor, and the proper conduct of those in power. Through these popular forms, the Black Dinner remained alive in Scottish cultural memory, even as its political significance receded. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Black Dinner had become integrated into broader narratives about Scottish national identity and history. The Scottish Enlightenment fostered new interest in examining the nation's past, while the Romantic movement created appetite for dramatic historical narratives that captured the supposed essence of national character. In this context, the Black Dinner was frequently cited as an example of the passionate, sometimes brutal nature of medieval Scottish politics. Writers like Sir Walter Scott reference the event in works that help define modern perceptions of Scottish history, ensuring its continued cultural relevance in an era far removed from its medieval origins. The 20th and 21st centuries have seen the Black Dinner transcend Scottish national boundaries to enter global popular culture, most notably through its influence on George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series and its television adaptation, Game of Thrones. Martin has explicitly acknowledged the Black Dinner, along with the Glencoe Massacre of 1692, as inspiration for the infamous Red Wedding scene, in which guests are murdered by their hosts in violation of sacred hospitality. This modern reimagining has introduced millions of viewers worldwide to the core elements of the medieval Scottish tragedy, albeit in fictionalized form. The visceral shock experienced by modern audiences watching the Red Wedding echoes the horror felt by medieval Scots upon learning of the Douglas brothers' fate. This modern cultural afterlife raises interesting questions about historical memory and its transmission. While the Game of Thrones version drastically alters the specific details and context, it preserves the emotional core of the original event, the profound violation of trust implied by killing guests under one's roof. The widespread reaction to the Red Wedding suggests that despite vast differences in social structure and values between medieval Scotland and the contemporary world, certain fundamental taboos remain recognizable and powerful. The betrayal of hospitality still registers as a particularly egregious transgression, worthy of special condemnation. What lessons might we draw from the Black Dinner that remain relevant in contemporary contexts? Perhaps the most obvious is a warning about the dangers of political expediency overwhelming ethical constraints. Crichton and Livingston convinced themselves that their perception of threat justified extraordinary measures, only to discover that their actions created new problems while failing to resolve the underlying issues. This pattern has repeated throughout history, with political actors rationalizing extreme measures that ultimately undermine the very stability they sought to preserve. The Black Dinner reminds us that means matter, not just ends, and that violations of fundamental norms often carry unexpected consequences. Another enduring lesson concerns the limitations of violence as a political tool. The murder of the Douglas brothers, while tactically successful in eliminating specific individuals, failed strategically because it did not address the structural foundations of Douglas power. Real political change required the comprehensive approach eventually employed by James II, combining military force with legal procedures, alliance building, and institutional reform. This fuller understanding of political power as multidimensional rather than merely coercive represents an insight that remains relevant in analyzing contemporary conflicts and transitions. The Black Dinner also illustrates the complex relationship between personal and structural factors in historical events. While individual decisions by Crichton, Livingston, and others directly shaped what happened on November 24th, 1440, these decisions occurred within a context of institutional constraints, cultural assumptions, and structural pressure. Understanding historical events requires attention to both levels of analysis, recognizing human agency while acknowledging the systems within which that agency operates. This balanced perspective applies equally to contemporary political analysis, where attributing outcomes solely to individual leaders or impersonal forces both represent oversimplifications. Perhaps most fundamentally, the Black Dinner demonstrates the power of narrative in shaping historical memory and political legitimacy. The Douglas family's ability to frame the event as a martyrdom story strengthened their position in subsequent conflicts. The Regents' failure to establish their version as the dominant narrative undermined their attempt to legitimize their actions. This struggle over interpretation reminds us that control of narrative represents a crucial dimension of political power, both historically and in the present. How events are remembered often proves as significant as what actually occurred. As we conclude this exploration of the Black Dinner, we might reflect on the peculiar immortality achieved by William and David Douglas, two young men who barely had opportunity to make their mark on the world through action, have nonetheless influenced centuries of cultural and political development through the manner of their deaths. Their story has been preserved not because of who they were or what they accomplished, but because of what was done to them, a violation of principles so fundamental that it demanded remembrance. In this sense, the Black Dinner transcends its specific historical moment to become a timeless parable about power, betrayal, and the essential values that bind even deeply divided societies. The stones of Edinburgh Castle still stand, having witnessed centuries more of Scottish history since that November evening in 1440. Tourists now walk through the Great Hall where the Douglas brothers dined on their last night, most unaware of the drama once enacted there. Yet, the echoes of the Black Dinner remain, preserved in historical records, cultural memory, and modern reinterpretations. The story continues to resonate because it speaks to something fundamental about human society: the tension between political necessity and moral constraint, and the consequences that follow when that tension resolves in favor of expediency over principle. In this resonance lies the true legacy of the Black Dinner, a medieval tragedy that still has much to teach us about the world we inhabit today. Thank you for joining me on this historical journey through one of Scotland's darkest chapters. If you've enjoyed this exploration of the Black Dinner, please consider subscribing to Insomnia History for more deep dives into history's most fascinating and often overlooked stories. Leave a comment with your thoughts or suggestions for future topics. Until next time, may your nights be filled with historical wonders rather than historical treachery.